So I want to thank Ellen and the working group for asking me to present this research. I really value the opportunity to talk about the work we did here. And I do want to also reiterate what Sarah said about please interrupt me with questions. To the extent you have questions about this, let's get them out during the first half hour so that the worship sharing can be building on this. And going to try to avoid that being a Q&A session. The let's see here if I can make this all work as it should be. I just want to acknowledge this was a big, I got a lot of co-authors on this paper. A lot of folks at Brattle raised their hand given the opportunity to work on this, and some of them, including Aidan and Caleb, have continued, have come into the project later, but have continued to keep this work alive. And you're going to see some of their efforts in the updates that I'm going to present tonight. This work came out of being asked. The Brattle Group was asked to do a project for ASIL, American Society of International Law, and the context of it really is an international law claim for reparations. I'll get into that into a second, but a lot of people outside of Brattle contributed this, including the researchers who put much of the data together that we ended up using, and the guidance we got from a number of people. But the whole thing was really led by or instigated by Judge Patrick Robinson, who was a justice from Jamaica on the International Court of Justice in The Hague. He retired last year, but he and I are still talking regularly and working on how to get this work done. And it's just been one of the best parts of this project is the friendship I've developed with him. So it's worth acknowledging. So as I said, this came out of some work. The context really here, and this is different from the context that the meeting is going to be interested in, but I think we can still use the research in a useful way. The context here is that under international law, transatlantic chattel slavery was wrong at the time it happened. It was wrong now, and it was wrong when it happened. And therefore, it's a crime that requires reparations, compensation and reparations. The parties under the international law theory that was developed are states, not individuals. So our task was to estimate these harms and the liabilities associated with them at the state level. So we estimated, the harm in the US or in Jamaica, and we estimated the harm that was caused by England or Portugal. But we have this research was not designed to answer sort of subnational or individual claims of harm. Yet I've extended it, or my team has extended it to try to answer some of those questions. And it's also important that this is in this context of reparations under an international law, the way that we set it up, at least in our paper, was that there was four aspects of this: restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, and satisfaction. The key part to this, though, is that what constitutes repair is something that is negotiated between the party that harmed and the party that was harmed. And so in this context, especially when you get to the compensation, but actually the full claims here, it's really what we're providing is an input, a starting point about economic harm that happened, but what money transfers hands, how it transfers, what's done with it, all of that is something that is not proscribed from the analyst. It is something that is negotiated, discussed, and agreed upon by the parties involved, including and particularly including the victim states. And so it's not aid and it's not an indulgence. It's a part of a larger process of recognizing a harm. So in estimating this, we looked, this is my inspiration for this work. There was a enslaved man named Jordan Anderson. Um, I forget what state he was in. I don't think it was Maryland though. And after a few years after the Civil War, when he was a free man, his former enslaver wrote him a letter asking him to come back to the plantation and work for wages. And I'm going to read just part of his response because it's just so perfect. He said this is in a letter to the man who used to own him. I served you faithfully for 32 years and Mandy 20 years. At 25 a month for me and 2 a week for Mandy, our earnings would amount to $11,680. Add to this the interest for the time our wages have been kept back, and deduct what you paid for our clothing and 3 doctor's visits to me and pulling the tooth for Mandy, and the balance will show what we are in justice entitled to. Please send the money to this address. And this, I think, is really the key part. If you fail to pay us for faithful labors in the past, how can we can have little faith in your promises in the future? And I think that this does 2 things. One is the man was a budding economist in how he thought about harm, so he's dear to my heart. And he sets up the point of all of this, which is if you don't take care of the past, you can't move forward. I'll go quickly through this. There's a big literature review on this. We build on the past works for our approach. What we try to do is quantify the harms that were caused by transatlantic chattel slavery in all the countries in the Americas. And in doing this, we separate our analysis into 2 time periods. So we take different approaches to estimating the harms that accrued during the period of enslavement, and separately we estimate a measure of the harms post enslavement, in that chattel slavery set up social norms and institutions, and its effects are still felt today strongly. And so there's a lot of harm from it that was caused even after it had ended. And so that's why but our approach to measuring those harms are somewhat different. At the core of the analysis, especially for the period of enslavement, is an estimate of foregone earnings. And I'm going to get into this in a little bit more detail because it really is the substance of it. But I just want to say there's sort of 2 approaches we took to answering this question. One is, in essence, what was the labor that was stolen from the enslaved person at the time it happened? How much was it worth then? What were the wages of a free person then? How much would you have paid them then had they not been enslaved? And then you can take that financial amount and apply an interest rate to it to bring it to today's dollars. And that's an approach we use, and we call that the 2.5% interest rate approach, because we use a 2.5% interest rate to bring those financial harms forward. An alternative approach, which is actually my preferred approach and has a lot of interesting economic merits, is the second approach we took. The problem with the first approach is that the financial techniques and infrastructure, the idea of an interest rate that's based on market transactions and so forth, really wasn't designed for the hundreds of years time span that we're dealing with here. 40 years, 50 years is a long time for a financial market to evaluate something. And so it sort of breaks down, as we'll see. An alternative approach would be to measure the labor that was stolen at the time the person was enslaved. But instead of translating it into dollars then, think of it as labor and bring that labor forward to today and ask the question, if that labor had been stolen today, how much would we have paid for it? That's the second approach we take. It turns out that sort of on average, it works out to the answer you'd kind of get if you had used a 2.3% interest rate, which might not seem like very different from 2.5, but as we'll see, even that small difference has a big impact. So the summary of all of this is that if you take the approach where you bring the labor forward today, and I'm going to go through all these other things we add on to the foregone earnings, but if you in total, if you take all the different harms that we measure, which are themselves incomplete, you get about $100 trillion in damage. That's across all time and all of the Americas. Similarly, if you take the other financial approach and use a 2.5% interest rate for the harms valued at the time they happened, that gets you to $130 trillion. And so you'll note just a small difference in effective interest rate has a pretty significant difference in the answer. The reason I like the first approach about wages is it gets away from arguing about what the interest rate should be. And given the sensitivity to that, that strikes me as a feature or a good thing. So now I'm going to go a little bit into a little bit more detail of the calculations quickly, but I'll try to do this. So during the period of enslavement, what we did was we looked at loss of life. So this is if you died in the Middle Passage, or also the fact that as an enslaved person in the Americas, your life expectancy was shorter. We look at the unpaid wages. We measure an amount for a compensation for the loss of liberty, which is separate from not being paid. There was a lot of physical harm, so we have a measure of compensation for personal injury. And then we have psychological mistreatment and gender-based violence, which was in addition to these other harms that we also measure separately. But we still don't measure everything, every harm that happened. And there's some things we just couldn't figure out the right tools to bring into a monetary framework. So things such as separation of family, political disenfranchisement, social isolation, there's many others that just didn't we acknowledge they exist, but they're not part of our calculation. The analysis starts, by the way, with an accounting of who the individuals were and when they lived. So just as a total, if you're not familiar with these numbers, the people well, there's about over 9 million people who were put on boats in Africa for the Middle Passage. And about 8 million of them got off on the other side, and 13% of them died during the passage. And then there was about another 10.5 million people who were born into slavery in the Americas. The vast majority of them were in the United States. The economic system around slavery was very different in the United States compared to the Caribbean and South America. There was much less family orientation, much less, many fewer births. I always love this chart. So this is a visual allocation of where folks came from. So this is the folks who were put on boats and from what territories were responsible for it. And as a partner of mine says, it sucks to be Portugal. They really are them and Britain stand alone, but of course their economies are very different today. To summarize what comes out for my preferred calculation here is this is what makes up the $100 trillion. That about a little under a third of it is foregone earnings, and then the other 2/3 are the other 4 categories I talked about earlier. Of course, I'm happy to go into any of these in any detail, but we're not going to have the time for me to do the whole thing right now. I'm also happy, by the way, to talk to anybody about this, so please reach out in any way that works. And this is the calculation. Yes.
I do have one quick question here,
Of
which is
course.
of that 100 trillion, do you have somewhere what percentage of that is attributable just in the United States?
I do. I don't have the number handy, but the report itself, and I have appendix tables, we could look it up, uh, break this all out by country. So the United States is a particularly interesting one because prior to 1776, the harm was attributable to the United Kingdom. And after 1776, it was attributed to the United States. But yes, you can break those out. And I think it's in the neighborhood of 20 some trillion dollars. Um, but but yes, those are broken out in the work. And then this is the other one. So so much of this is centered around this lost wages. And here we do a kind of interesting trick, little economist trick here, which is the first two things that we are trying to measure are a loss of life. So either you died in the Middle Passage or your life was shortened because you were enslaved compared to had you lived here as a free person. And we also want to measure the labor that was stolen or uncompensated. And in both cases, the economic tool we use is lost wages for a person. So the idea that obviously for stolen labor, you can look at a wage rate and think about what was that worth. But it turns out that the way economists would measure a loss of life would be something along the lines of how much would that person have earned in their lifetime. Now, I just want to stop and say that's an incredibly unsatisfying analytic technique to suggest that somebody has a value and that it's based on their earnings. But there's a lot of reasons why that's a useful way to when you are in a position where you need to translate a life into a dollar amount. That's a useful approach. Again, love to have lunch or dinner with anybody who wants to talk at length about why, the pluses and minuses of that approach. But anyway, that's the approach we took. So now I want to illustrate this with an example. So I don't have a particular person in mind. I wasn't able to kind of figure out like an actual person, but I did want to bring what this analysis meant back to our local community and our meetings. So go with me here. Imagine that there was an enslaved woman who was born in Montgomery County in the year 1750. So we don't know how long she would have lived. We don't have there was no data on what the estimate of the life expectancy of an enslaved person was at that time. But we do know that a free white woman would have been expected to live about 57 and a quarter years. So by combining the time, the wages that were stolen from her and the portion of her life that was taken from her, we can measure it by the expected life of a white person born at that time. So using the current wages approach, that if we had compensated somebody $72,000, $73,000 a year in wages, and if we had taken 52 and a quarter years of their life from them, the harm would be $3.8 million in today's dollars. And that's the essence of, although we do this, for 20 million people, this illustrates the way the calculation was made. And it also points out that the model has in it the ability, should we care to identify actual individuals in our community, we would have the tools to measure their lives and think about the harm, the economic harm from lost wages and a shortened life for them. This is the same example, but with the other technique, which is if you took those 52 and a quarter years and paid her the $95.54 a year somebody would have earned back then you would have owed her $4,992 almost 300 years ago. Now, if you took that almost $5,000 and applied a 2.5% interest rate to it to bring the financial harm, the financial debt forward to today, you end up with about $4.4 million. And so I think that nicely illustrates the way the two approaches work. So this is, I'll skip over that. This is across all of the areas. This one might be a little hard to read, but here's where I then add in the other harms from the period of enslavement. So if you can read that, the foregone earnings. Let's take the bottom panel, the one that has to do with using current wages. At 2020 wages, those foregone earnings representing loss of life and stolen wages would be $3.8 million. There's then an accounting for loss of liberty. So what, in addition to that, is the harm from an individual not being free? Here again, because we're measuring an economic measure, we use a study on manumissions that found that the price of a manumission was about 20% higher than the price of the same individual had they been sold to another enslaver instead of freed. So there's a lot of problems with this, but it's a good first start. There seemed to have been about a 20% premium on value of the person as a slave, as an enslaved person, a 20% premium to free them. So we use 20% of the first category, what their foregone earnings were. We add 20% for the loss of liberty. We also, as I noted, had an accounting for personal injury. Again, we looked toward, it was a 9/11 commission, and we looked at how they compensated lives that were lost versus lives that were injured in the World Trade Center tragedy, and found that on average it was about 11. The loss of the personal injury claims were about 11% of the claims for a life that was lost. And so again, we just simply apply that ratio to the value of the life that we have estimated earlier. And that adds, so in this example, the loss of liberty would add about $760,000 to our hypothetical person from Montgomery County, and the personal injury would be another $418,000. The last two categories on gender-based violence and mental pain and anguish, we used a different technique, which is we looked at current day, modern day international court rulings for these harms. And there's a lot that goes into it. There's a lot of different court rulings with different amounts. But when we sort of sorted through all of it, in our judgment, a claim of $50,000 a year based on the gender-based violence seemed to be what courts had evaluated that harm, compensation for that harm in today's dollars. And similarly, about $30,000 a year for mental pain and anguish. So we add that in for the relevant years of the person's life. But those dollars are already in current dollars. And so there's no issue about adjustment around them. So that adds
Coleman,
up.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
So how did you figure how many years they were going to live? I mean, 52.25 years for an average white person, is that really relevant for an enslaved person?
Well, it was 57.25 for the white person. And so what we did is we said, if you were born in the US, so it's different if you came off the Middle Passage, but for somebody who was born here, we said your working life started at age 5, and that's when labor was being stolen from you, and that you would have lived up until whatever your life expectancy was, and that we're paying you for those stolen wages. Whatever the time from that life expectancy to the life expectancy of a free white person, that's the separate harm of a shortened life, but it's compensated the same way as the first was. So we just do both of those in one calculation. So by valuing the wages of a stolen life as if it had been a free white person, we are simultaneously compensating for the wages that were actually stolen and the portion of the life that was stolen from the individual. And of course, that's with the presumption that, but for slavery, had that person been here, they would have had the same life expectancy. So this is the summary of the quantifiable harms. The range has to do with which of the two approaches we're taking. So now briefly for the period post-enslavement, there's a ton of, from Jim Crow and all of the color bias and the lack of access to opportunities, the lack of access to government programs. There's a huge number of things that lead to disparities that are a sort of a direct result of the outgrowth of slavery. Rather than measuring them all, and although this is a well-accepted approach we took, I think it really undercounts the harm, but it had the benefit of being doable. So here what we did is we looked at the difference in wealth, a disparity in wealth as a measure of the harms that have accrued since the time of slavery. And in the U.S., it was straightforward in that we have plenty of good data on what the average wealth of a white American versus a Black American is. In the rest of the Americas, we took a slightly different approach, which is because, like in a country like Jamaica, that same comparison wouldn't be as informative. But what we did there was look at the wealth disparity between an average person in the colonial power versus the victim state. So for the Jamaican calculation, it would be the disparity in wealth between a Jamaican today and a British citizen today living in the UK. And we add that up for all of the people of color within the countries today, is how we do it. Again, there's a lot of reasons that's not a perfect measure, but it's a tractable one. The other thing we did, just because it's so offensive, we had to include it, was there have been reparations paid in the past, but always to the enslavers, not the enslaved. And so we were instructed that legally we could treat that as a unjust enrichment claim. And so we spent some time calculating that. It turns out, even in today's dollars, to only be about $12.5 billion, which is a rounding error in the trillions that we're measuring. So they don't actually show up in the graphs, but it's an important part to keep in here. So post-enslavement, $23 trillion is the wealth disparity. An important thing about that I want to point out is, and this goes back to why repair is more than compensation, that if you made a payment and eliminated the wealth disparity in America today, it wouldn't stay eliminated unless you did other things to level the playing field. And I think that's a really important part of this. It's not just about paying money, it's about a lot more. The money is an important part of it, but it's never going to be sufficient in and of itself. And we also note that there's a whole bunch of other disparities that we measure. They're not necessarily economic, they're not quantifiable in the same way, so we don't add them in, but we do note that there's just a lot of. And then the last thing I wanted to do is just to put this in a little context, just because the numbers are so huge. So what this chart is showing you is the claims against the various states. This is where my point about it sucks to be Portugal. The harms caused by the different states as a multiple of their gross domestic product today. So, for example, the United Kingdom, it's almost 10 times their GDP. The United States, it's I think around twice our GDP is what our total harms would be. And that, it's just worth acknowledging that. It's also worth noting that these are harms that took 500 years to develop. There's no reason to think that they should be proportionate to the income of 1 year of a country. So, and they're not going to be paid off, even if there was an intent, they wouldn't be paid off quickly. So another way of thinking about it is as a share of the wealth of the country. And here you can see it varies quite a bit by really how well off the countries are. But even in the United States, the richest country in the world, it's only about 15% of our wealth that represents the total amount of harm that we've had. Yes, Ellen, please come on in. You're still on mute.
Thank you. My hand went up a few moments ago when you were talking about repair is more than compensation. Could you elaborate more on that?
So, in your introduction today, you talked about things like acknowledgement and other aspects other than just monetary compensation that are important for reparations in our context. In this paper, in the international law context, it was the satisfaction as well as compensation. There was the 4 categories at the beginning that are all part of it, and they need to. So it's more than just the financial compensation to really do repair, and a key part of it really is that it's decided by the victim state. Like the victim state has to be in agreement, or the victim, in any sense, the harmed party has to be a party to deciding what the repair is. There are proposals in the UK, in CARICOM, in the Caribbean, in the UK, about like aid and how much England wants to give. Or there's been a couple of examples of descendants of plantation owners in the Caribbean making donations that they call reparations, or payments that they call reparations. But separate from the fact that the amount of money that they're giving is woefully inadequate to compensate for the harm caused, they're not reparations simply because they're a one-way donation. And it's money, but it's not reparations, because reparations are something that are bilateral or multilateral agreement reached.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Sure. So I think actually we're just about done with the main part. This is just for the nerdy folks to recognize that how sensitive the results are to the interest rate. And I'll just say we have at the 2.3% interest rate is our $100 trillion number, and the other one I presented at 2.5% is 130 trillion. At just 3%, that number grows to 350 trillion, which is approaching all of the financial wealth in the world today. And at 5%, which is a interest rate that's not crazy, it's 300 quadrillion dollars, or whatever the next thing up above trillions is. So it's just to show how sensitive these calculations are to interest rates. So that's me nerding out. And then the rest is just appendix to answer questions. So I'm gonna stop sharing at this point.
Thanks for watching our video. For more content from Sandy Spring Friends Meeting, click to subscribe.